Okay, so our first book of the year, the Odyssey. Does anybody know about this book? Besides that it's thick and probably boring.
Wait, there's another version of the book, right?
Yeah, so
It's about the gods.
the gods? Which gods?
I remember one version told me, I just don't remember exactly.
I don't know. I read this my freshman year.
Okay, so some of you guys have seen some of these things before. This is, so first of all, if you look at the cover, you notice, what does it say right below the Odyssey? It says Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition. Then what does it say? Translated by Robert Fago. So, what language? Yep.
Greek.
Greek, yes. So, Greek. I've written the name there in Greek. He Odyssey. It's written in Greek, ancient Greek. Any guesses how old? Anybody know how old this work is?
I don't know. I'm guessing before.
More than 1,000 years. Yes, before Christ. So over 2,000 years. This is about 2,800 years old, this work. Okay, it's been around that long.
I just don't know what I got.
Well, so it gets a bit more impressive once you learn a little bit more about where this comes from. So it's written in Greek, and this is a particular type of work. So usually, when we talk about literature, there are different genres. We've got novels, maybe historical fiction, fantasy, horror, what's some other genres? Romance, drama, tragedy, comedy. These are all genres, types of literature. What type of literature is this? It's not a novel. This is older than novels. It's not a play, like Shakespeare, but that's a little closer.
What's that?
This is an epic. Okay, it's an epic. It's a particular type of work. An epic. It comes from the Greek word epos.
So epic. So like, what is epic?
What is epic? Anybody know what that means when we say that a work is an epic? Not in the sense of, oh man, that was epic. I mean, that's related to this.
Does that mean like there's like fighting?
Yes. Yeah. There's going to be battles. We're going to have what? Heroes. Yes, in epic we're going to have heroes, and somebody mentioned before we're going to have gods. Our characters are not going to be normal people. That's one of the things to keep in mind. Our characters are going to be heroes and gods. Normal people don't really make much of an appearance in epics. We'll see them occasionally, but they're not main characters. That's part of what makes an epic an epic. Novels, on the other hand, are usually about normal people. Heroes and gods. Here are the Greek gods, Greek pagan gods. What else are we going to have that makes something an epic? Not just that there are gods and heroes in it. There's a particular format for an epic.
It's very like
Okay, so we're dealing with elements of myth, not a play, but it is a poem. It is a poem. This book is one giant long poem. It's hard to tell in English, but in Greek, it's one giant long poem. A massive poem. There's a particular style of poetry for epic. It's called, in case you're curious, dactylic hexameter. So you might know that Shakespeare usually writes in what's called iambic pentameter, which means that each line has the rhythm ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. There's 5 patterns of unstressed stress. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves have all too short a date. There's 5 of those each line. This, on the other hand, is dactylic hexameter. It's going to have groups of 6. It works a little differently in Greek than in English. Greek poetry is a bit different, but I'll give you a sense of what it sounds like in Greek. And in Greek, the poetry is not based on the stressed syllables, and it's not based on rhyming. Rather, it's based on the rhythm of the words. So, in dun da da 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 dun dun 6. And so here are the first couple lines of a different epic in Greek, not this one, but a different epic in Greek. And try to listen for that rhythm. This is the rhythm of the actual language itself. Men inaidetea peleiadao Achilleos Ulomenen, Hemiria, Kayo, Salge, Takim. Polastiptimus psychasairi proiapsim. Autus te loria teuke, oio doisite passim. Dios te teleuetobula. You hear that rhythm there in the words. That's how the poetry is based. And for epic, in Greek and in Latin also, it will always have that same rhythm, dactylic hexameter. Who wrote this? Who wrote this poem?
Homer.
Homer. Who's Homer? Don't say Homer Simpson. That's part of what's funny about that character is that he's got the same name as Homer. Anyone know anything about Homer?
No.
Yes, exactly. No, we don't know very much about Homer. Supposedly, according to legend, he was blind, lived about 2,800 years ago in Greece, but we don't know much about him. He lived during a time period called the Greek Dark Ages. We say Dark Ages because we don't know very much about this time. You want to know why we don't know much about this time period in Greek history? About 2,800 years ago? Because it's old. We know plenty about Egyptian history during that time. Why do we know lots about Egyptian history during that time? Okay, they built pyramids, things that last a long time. And what do you often see on pyramids and other Egyptian buildings? Inscriptions using hieroglyphics. The Greeks at this time did not have a writing system. They had no way of writing their language. Before this time period, they had a writing system. It was not really well suited for their language. And then there was a period of civilizational unrest and collapse, and they lost the ability to use that writing system. And it wasn't until after this time period that they developed a new writing system, the Greek alphabet, which then also became the Latin alphabet, which then became our alphabet. So they didn't have anything to write with. So where does this come from? If the Greeks didn't have any way to write this down. Any guesses? How would you get it?
Did he make it up?
What?
Did he like?
He did, but he didn't have any way to write it down. Writing. What was that? They memorized it. Yes. Memorized. Homer recited this poem from memory, or composed it and recited from memory, and then other people learned it. They memorized the whole thing, and usually if you were this type of person, a bard is this sort of poet entertainer. This was entertainment at the time. You find a guy who knows a story like this and can tell it really well, and he'd be your entertainment for the evening. Probably not the whole thing. This would probably take a couple of weeks of entertainment.
So when he didn't write this.
He didn't write it down.
Somebody else listened to him talk and then told somebody else?
Yes, exactly. And they went on for a couple of generations, and then they developed a writing system, and then they wrote it down. Yeah, that's what they did. And then, there were a couple of different versions at that time. So then some guys, some scholars got together, and they said, well, this is what we think is the most correct version. And that's basically what we have nowadays. How was he able to do that? How could he memorize thousands of lines of poetry? Well, for one thing, people had really good memories at that time because they didn't have a writing system. There wasn't anything else to go by. So you just have to get really good at memorizing things. Also, another feature of epic is what we call epithets. An epithet is a descriptor for someone. In epic, you don't generally talk about Odysseus or Zeus or any other character. You always say something about them. You might say Zeus who gathers the storm clouds. You might say Odysseus, the man of twists and turns. You might say Juno with the ox's eyes. You might say white-armed Circe, something like that. There will always be something to describe the person. And that makes it easier to remember the whole thing, because there are only so many different ways that you're going to talk about any particular person. Shining Achilles is a famous example. Godlike Achilles. Lord of Men, Agamemnon. And so that makes it a lot easier to remember because a good amount of what you're saying is repeated. You might talk about shining Achilles in one part, you might talk about swift Achilles in another part, but it makes it easier to remember the whole thing. Okay, so you notice that in this writing style. We don't just talk about ships, we talk about black ships or hollow ships. Okay, what else is Homer known for? Not just the Odyssey, but another work. The Iliad. The Iliad. Some of you might have read that before. There's an edition of the Iliad, which is, it looks very similar to this, except it's got blue here instead of red, by the same translator. The Iliad is his other work, actually a bit more famous for that, historically speaking. Okay. That's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with an epic from the ancient Greek world that was memorized, deals with heroes and gods and all these sorts of things. That's the kind of thing that we have here. It is weird. This is very different from the kind of things that we're used to reading about nowadays. It is. It's very foreign to us. So if it strikes you as kind of strange, this whole work, that's normal, because it is. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the background here in terms of the story. If you go and you see the latest, I don't know, Spider-Man movie or whatever, do they explain the whole backstory and what the whole deal with Spider-Man is?
No,
No, why?
because you show you have a background knowledge.
Right, they're assuming that you already know about it. If you're going to see a Spider-Man movie or whatever DC or Marvel movie, does DC make movies? Yes? Okay, see, like, I don't know much about these things. Anyway, so if you're going to see one of these movies, generally, they assume that you have some knowledge of it already. And that's the case here with the Odyssey and the Iliad. Is when Homer's writing this,
That's what I read.
you read the Iliad, okay, yeah. So that will help you with some of the background here. When Homer is telling these stories, this is his version of the story. These stories, the Greeks were already telling. These are stories from their mythology. They had heard them before. Here, this is his remake of it, his version of it, which people thought was the best version. That's why they preserved it. So he assumes that the people that he's telling these stories to, they already know the deal with Greek myths. They know who Zeus is. They know who Poseidon is. They know who Odysseus is. All these names that might not be familiar to you. The audience knows who they are. That can make it difficult for us to read because we don't know who all these people are. We don't know what all these places are that they're talking about. You know, if you talk about Gotham City and Batman, okay, you know, you and I know a lot of background there. I don't need to explain it to you. But if somebody from, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, if you're trying to tell them a story about Batman in Gotham City, you're going to have to explain a lot. So I want to make sure that we're familiar with some of the background here with the Greek myth. What's the sort of general overarching storyline that this is part of? The same way that, like, I don't know, there's like Avengers. Is that sort of like an overarching thing? I feel like there are a whole bunch of Avengers movies, and they've got their own separate movies, right? So, like, that's kind of one big overarching myth or legend there. What's the overarching storyline that the Odyssey is part of? The Iliad is part of this story too. Say it again, a little louder. The Trojan War. The Trojan War. Kyle was mentioning this other translation of the Odyssey, which has a picture of it's this famous picture that one of the moon landings they took. It's a picture of the Earth taken from the moon, so you see the moon in front and the Earth behind. That same guy, when he translated the Iliad, you remember what the picture on the cover of that one is? It's the D-Day landing.
What?
The D-Day landing. On the beaches at Normandy, July 6th, 1945. Is this familiar to all of you? No? All right, so the Second World War starts in really 1939. U.S. doesn't get involved until the end of 41. The Germans rampaged through most of Europe, and it was looking really bad. They conquered France for the most part, a lot of the countries surrounding them. And the problem is that Britain was still in the fight, the U.S. is still in the fight, but Britain is across the channel from the rest. On the beaches of northern France, where there were massive German forces waiting for them, and they're landing on boats, getting shot at the whole time, trying to just take over a small spot on the beach so that they can start their push through the rest of Europe. And that was the beginning of the end for Germany in the Second World War, was that successful landing. But the Second World War for us as Americans often has this sort of mythical aspect to it. You know, that's you know, that was the war where we went and we saved Europe. You know, we were the good guys, and it changed the U.S.'s position in the world by winning in that war. For the Greeks, the Trojan War was kind of like that. It was this formative experience. That was the good old days for them. All right, we got to pause there. We'll talk more about the Trojan War.